We're here today to speak to Pat Wisher, who's the author of a fantastic book, Ice Cream and Chips. And it's all about your experience of caring for your husband, Alan, with dementia, wasn't it?
That's right, yes.
So what brought you to write the book?
Well, essentially I wanted Alan to be remembered. And at first I wanted to set up a foundation in his name. But I then decided that there were too many charities really in Guernsey. And my cousin said to me when I was discussing it with him, well, why don't you write a book? And I thought, my goodness, I've never thought of writing a book. And then I thought, well, actually, I'd written very detailed diaries since 1995, and therefore perhaps I might be able to produce something using those diary entries. So that's really how it came about. So I started writing the book earlier in the year and self-published it. And all the proceeds are going to the Alzheimer's charities, which is great, I think.
Oh, that is fantastic. And you reading it, you do really get a sense of, I think, of Alan, his character, and you cover some of your early life together, don't you?
Yes, the first part of the book is our life together. We met at the BBC in the 60s, and then we were lucky enough to buy an apartment as our first property, which was lucky because my father had died when I was 15 and left me a bit of money. And then we both worked in London. I worked at the BBC with Alan, and then later moved on to another job which involved television and educational television. But we commuted up to London. After our apartment, we bought another property, and so the first part of the book really is all about us and our properties. Which I don't know. Some people might find it interesting, but it was. I think it sets the tone of what sort of people we were like. We really liked our homes, and that was one of the reasons why when Alan was diagnosed with dementia, I was absolutely adamant that I wanted to look after him at home, because I really thought he would hate going into a care home, and I certainly wouldn't want to be put in a care home. So that was important, really. Our homes were important to us, but we weren't very sociable as a couple. We didn't have children, so caring for him was quite difficult for me because I didn't have that experience of even looking after children. So. It was quite tough. It was quite tough.
And you really get a sense from the descriptions that you gave of your early years together, or your life together. It really gave a sense of Alan as a very fiercely independent person, and that was perhaps one of the troubles that you had when he became ill.
He was a very private person, very private. We had our own bathrooms. And I would never have been allowed to go into his bathroom. And he was a very studious person, really. He loved reading, and he loved his music, which was his obviously his what he knew best. He wasn't very sociable. He didn't. When we came back to Guernsey, he didn't really. Get involved with anything in Guernsey other than the Occupation Society. He had a huge library, and it was all about military stuff, and he was very knowledgeable on both world wars. So that was the only thing he got involved in Guernsey. So yes, he just liked his home. He liked his food. And unfortunately, he liked his alcohol. And that was one of the reasons that Alan started to become ill, because he did have an alcohol problem, I'm afraid. And
You're
that's
very honest and frank about that in the book.
Yes, well, it's to do with London in the 60s and life in showbiz in the 60s. If you look back at the films of the 60s, everybody's smoking and drinking, aren't they? So it was just what people did in those days, and unfortunately he was addicted to it, and that was, one of the reasons that I think it led to dementia. I believe it is one of the things that does lead to dementia. So yeah.
And perhaps one of the reasons why it took some time for him to be diagnosed, or for you to realise there was an underlying problem.
Yes, I mean, the first thing that happened was that he started to lose his mobility. It was his balance, actually. At the beginning of the book, if I can just read this little bit, is that okay? So this is the start of chapter 1. It was a sunny day in October 2008 in the beautiful Krka National Park in Croatia when I first realised that there was something badly wrong with Alan's mobility. The route through the park was a boardwalk. At the start of it, there was a handrail, and then absolutely nothing to hold on to for the rest of the walk, which went over a series of streams. Alan was rooted to the spot at the start of the walk and was unable to continue without holding on to me. He had completely lost his balance. Throughout the holiday, he avoided taking part in the walking tours, preferring to sit in a cafe and have coffee. That was the start of a gradual decline in his mobility. So that was 2008 when I started noticing that there were problems. He wasn't diagnosed with dementia until 2013. My book actually does criticise HSC in some bits, but in other bits, throughout his illness, they were marvellous. I mean, I met some wonderful doctors and nurses and professionals. But one of the things I found early on, I was really worried about Alan and his drinking. Because he was such a private man, he wouldn't let me go to see his doctor. And we had separate doctors. And on one occasion, I noticed there was a letter for him, and it was about diabetes. And I had absolutely no idea he had diabetes. The letter, it was inviting him to a diabetes forum or meeting. And I went into my surgery and said, look, my husband's received this letter and I'd like to know more about it. I didn't know he had diabetes. I'd like to know more about it. And I was quoted patient confidentiality. So apparently, unless the person you're asking about is disabled or mentally disabled, they won't tell you anything. So that really put me off pursuing his illness. And it's several years later that I plucked up courage to write to his doctor and say, look, I'm really worried about Alan. I think he's putting on weight. He's really not well. There's something wrong with him. I thought he had Parkinson's at the time. And his doctor was wonderful. His doctor came straight back, brought him into the surgery to have a chat with him, did some tests, and then he actually emailed me back and said, do you mind if I tell him that you wrote to me? And I said, no, please, don't do that. He'd be furious. He would be absolutely furious. Anyway, he didn't. And then I emailed him back and said, by the way, I didn't mention it in my letter, but Alan does have an alcohol problem. And I told him how many bottles we put in the bottle bank every week. And he was shocked. And so he called him back in again. And he gave him an ultimatum. And he said, the first thing you've got to do is to give up alcohol. then you've got to lose weight, and then we're going to see what happens after that. And
Alan took that very seriously, didn't he? He responded
Alan
well.
was marvellous. I never thought he would give up alcohol, but he was absolutely brilliant. I had been trying to get him to give up for years. My father died of alcohol poisoning, and he used to turn around to me and say, "I'm not like your father. I'm not an alcoholic." And I used to say, "Oh, but you're drinking far too much." Anyway, he was wonderful. He gave up alcohol, and within two or 3 months, he'd lost 2 stone in weight. So that was great. That was great. He didn't give up smoking, but he did give up alcohol. So yes, so that was the start of it, and it was soon after that visit to his doctor that dementia was confirmed.
I think you said in the book that that was in 2013.
2013, yes.
But that you had asked the question, is it dementia, and you had the answer yes.
There's a bit here in my book about this. I can find the bit. Yeah, 17th of June, 2013. Very bad night, very confused. You have to watch Alan all the time in case he harms himself. Appointment with the consultant in the day assessment unit. I was told I was right not to bring him into hospital when he was very confused. They can't do anything. They can't do anything for him. Just need to watch out for infection. I asked if it was dementia, and the answer was yes. This was the first time I'd been officially told that Alan had dementia. The next couple of days were the same, and then he was marginally better, although he'd lost interest in doing anything like reading the paper or watching television. So that was, yes, I didn't know it was dementia. I had to ask whether it was dementia. So, yes.
And it was in 2014 when you were told officially that it was vascular dementia.
Yes, yes. So that was, in fact, my very good friend Maggie Coston, who sadly died recently, was the person who told me what his walking problems were. She said that it was his brain not communicating with his legs, and that was why he used to stop and not be able to walk properly, and that's what vascular dementia is, I gather. I was very ignorant. I really didn't know anything about any of this. Just learnt as we went along, really.
Yeah. Well, that's where your book's really useful for other people to learn from. And you've given some hints and tips, haven't you, as to the particular lessons that you felt you wish you'd known sooner.
Yes. I had no idea of the stages of dementia. You read quite a lot about it, but nearly always it's about early onset dementia, when people get a bit forgetful and do strange things. Alan had gone past that stage when he was diagnosed with dementia. I felt that there wasn't anything out there, or I hadn't seen anything out there, other than a wonderful research document from Alzheimer's UK, which I didn't discover until 2015. But there was nothing out there which gave you an idea of what it was really like through early onset, right through the stages you go through. And that's why I really wanted to write about it, warts and all, I say, because the double incontinency side of it was very difficult to deal with, very difficult. The worst bit, really. But then you got the various stages of delirium, and then you got the stages of aggressiveness, escaping, trying to escape from the house. Alan would sit at the front door and would bash the handle of the door and want to go out. And that was the start of the ice cream and chips, really, that stage, because I realised that I really needed to take him out all the time. If he wanted to go out, I had to take him out. He used to drive to the Richmond kiosk, and I used to say to him, what ice cream would you like today? And he used to say vanilla. It was probably because he only remembered the word vanilla, but also I thought that he must be missing his alcohol. So I used to say to him, oh no, you know, let's give you something a bit more interesting. And so I used to get him rum and raisin. And I used to sneak in alcohol into his food. Alan loved his food. He really loved his food, and I loved cooking. And so every so often I'd do something where I could sneak in a bit of alcohol. Like a sherry trifle and some red cabbage with port in it and things like that. So I used to do that. But yeah, the stages were difficult.
You mentioned something specifically about sundowning and how you hadn't realised that was an issue.
Now that was really interesting. He used to get worse at night. He'd be quite good during the daytime and quite talkative, and then at night he used to start not being able to walk or to stand or to move, and would start screaming, this sort of thing. And I didn't know what it was about, really. And one of the carers I had mentioned this thing about, she jokingly mentioned it to me. Oh yes, she said, we call it sundowning. So it was when the sun went down, when it was dark. It was only much later when I found something on the internet about sundowning that I realised it was actually a condition which there'd been a lot of research about it, and actually it gave you ideas of how to deal with it. And I wish I'd found that document much earlier, because I didn't realise that it was actually a condition, because the carer sort of joked about it. Oh yes, we call it sundowning. I didn't realise it was actually a condition. Yeah.
And he liked to have his light on, didn't he, at night time?
He did. Yes, he
did. Do you think?
Yeah. We had to compromise on that. He liked to have the bedside light on, and so I used to say, oh no, I can't sleep with the light on. So we used to compromise a bit on that. So we would leave the hall light on. And it was very interesting when I was building the wet room for Alan, that we went into the Rockane Bay apartments for a month or 5 weeks it was, and sundowning didn't occur during that period, and it was only afterwards I thought to myself, my goodness, you know, it must have been something about the light of that area. It was a bit like this, with lots of light, and it was a kitchen and living room all in one, whereas we had separate rooms. And I realised that was what was happening. I think that the light was better for him. So it's interesting.
You mentioned a few times in the book about the changes that you had to make to your home to accommodate Alan's needs and mobility issues.
Yes.
And that was something sometimes that you wished you'd known about sooner.
Yeah. It's actually, it was one of the things when I was thinking about the foundation that I wanted to set up, one of the things I wanted to do is actually what you're doing, which is, so it's lovely to see your charity, because I wanted to provide advice through the experience I'd had, and I also wanted to provide funds to help people look after their loved ones in their own home, because it was expensive. My house is an upside-down house, so bedrooms are downstairs, but all the lovely views over to Liu Island are upstairs. And the kitchen's upstairs, the living room was upstairs. I had to spend a lot of money making the downstairs like this with a hard floor. I had to take out all the carpets and make it a hard floor. lots of equipment, of course, that had to be bought, and generally putting in lots of grab rails and things, which the occupational therapists were very good about. Stair lifts. Now, throughout Alan's illness, everybody was telling me that my stairs were dangerous. They were steep stairs, and I needed a stair lift. And I kept saying, no, I'm not having it. I want Alan to keep walking for as long as possible. And Alan was a very determined person. After his initial years in the BBC, when he was a music producer, he then went into administrative work in what we would call premises and estates. And he was responsible for, amongst other things, security. And he was terribly security conscious. And the one thing which I found amazing throughout his illness was that he knew whether he was capable of doing something. He knew whether he was capable of walking up the stairs or not. And so we had rails both sides, and he would walk up the stairs and he would walk down the stairs. And there were only certain occasions when he was really ill that he wasn't able to do that. And so I started with an interim measure. I had a day bed downstairs and I took it upstairs. So on occasions when he was going through sundowning and wasn't well in the evening, and I didn't feel confident that he could walk downstairs safely, we would sleep upstairs. And it was a long, long time before I agreed to have a stair lift put in. It was when he was getting really bad during the last stages of his illness, and so I put the stair lift in, and he ignored it. He ignored it. He wouldn't use it until for weeks he wouldn't use it. He continued to walk up the stairs, and then it came to a point when he was getting even worse, and then for the first time I had to put him on the stair lift and take him down. And after that, he did go. I did use the stair lift, but he still continued to walk up those stairs. There's a lovely little bit in here, if I can find it. Yes, this is a bit which is again typical of Alan and his security consciousness. Right, Alan had come out of hospital. This is 2015. He'd come out of a clinical ward on the 22nd of January. This was the 7th of February. He hadn't been out since then. So, 7th of February, Alan sat at the front door after a late breakfast, and he told me he could manage to go out. The first time since coming out of hospital. So he tried it, and it was amazing. He managed the steps without any difficulty and got in the car. We went to Richmond for ice cream, and they were pleased to see us and asked after Alan. Alan managed to get back into the house okay. It was marvellous. Then he went upstairs in the stair lift, and he stayed in the kitchen while I cooked the Sunday roast. I used the stair lift to get him downstairs and into bed. I had wondered whether the traumatic fall down the stairs, he'd had a bad fall, would mean that Alan would now accept the stair lift, but the next day he again walked upstairs unaided while I was preparing the lunch. He obviously knew that it was safe for him to do so. I never questioned his decision. And this was the security conscious bit of his brain, which was still there right to the end. It was quite amazing. I don't know enough about brains as to where that security conscious bit is, but he knew whether he could do something or not, and it was wonderful. So that was great.
And you did experience a few points people begging to differ, really, didn't you?
Oh
Professionals
dear,
telling
dear,
you.
dear. Yes, I did. Yes. You want me to talk about Delancey, do you?
Yeah, well, that is a particularly shocking part of the book, I have to say. So it's page 101.
Yeah.
Um,
This was, as I said earlier, that Alan wasn't a sociable person, and actually neither of us were particularly sociable. I had put off agreeing to have a social worker. I suppose I have this vision of social workers taking children away from families and things like this, and I was scared. I was scared that they would take my Alan away from me. So this was, we had a visit from the social worker and the occupational therapist. No, it was two social workers on this particular day, and they wanted us to go to the Alzheimer's Society Association. I get them confused. The Alzheimer's Association at Delancey for one of their sessions on a Wednesday when they have carers and they're the people they care for, and they separate them into different rooms, and then they have people talking. I knew Alan wouldn't want to go. I didn't particularly want to go myself, but I thought perhaps it might be useful to me to talk to other carers. So we decided. I decided we'd better go. So this is 14th of October. We had a quick lunch, then went to Delancey for the dementia carers meeting. I got Alan out of the car and was wheeling him inside when I was waylaid by the psychiatrist who we'd seen on the Monday. She told me that they had arranged to take Alan into the Sarnia ward at the Duchess of Kent. We had to go straight away. Our social worker phoned to say our OT had been concerned about my safety, so it was apparently for my benefit. Poor Alan didn't know what was going on. I was astounded that I hadn't been pre-warned about this. I was really upset, and Alan, of course, blamed me. He thought I had engineered it. We had to drive to the Duchess of Kent immediately, where we saw the consultant psychiatrist that I had seen in hospital. Sarnia ward was a dementia assessment ward, and I was told Alan would be there for about 3 weeks while they tried out new medication. I wasn't against that, but the method of hijacking us in the car park and taking us to the ward without any warning was, I believed, totally out of order. They read me the mental health law, and from then onwards I was petrified that Alan would be sectioned. I had to go home and return with 3 sets of clothes for Alan. I managed to get him out of Sarnia ward after 10 days, but that was I thought, dreadful. Alan certainly was very cross with me because he thought it was all to do with me. But there was a good thing about being in Sarnia ward. We had the psychiatrist now looking after him, and he was put on the dementia drug, Memantine. At this stage, he was well advanced. He was well advanced. He wasn't in the early onset of dementia. He was certainly moderate to late stages. This is October 2015, and he died a year later. So it was quite late being on that drug, but I was glad that he was put on that drug, and his psychiatrist was wonderful. There's one bit here. Can I read about one of the things? His psychiatrist came and visited us later. And he wrote very, very detailed notes about what his conversation had been with Alan. Alan was trying to escape as usual. He said that he wanted to go out because I don't like it here. But very soon after corrected me, stating, I don't want to go anywhere, I just want to work. When asked where he was, he replied, off Oxford Street, in London. He also stated, I'm very well, I'm not stupid, so let's cut that out. But at another moment, I'm stupid and silly. Yes, I am. We then agreed that he was restless, adding that restlessness is the story of my life. So it's lovely. The reference to just off Oxford Street was, of course, the BBC building in Bond Street, where we had first met. At another time, when asked where he was, he had said Northolt, which was Alan's family home. Sadly, he never said Guernsey. And he didn't know who I was at that spot at that time.
That must have been really hard for you.
Yeah, I wasn't aware that he didn't know who I was, actually. I really wasn't aware of it. It didn't worry me. It didn't worry me. He was just my Alan.
You really stuck to your guns because on several occasions you had to really fight to keep Alan at home, didn't you?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. I suppose because I'd spent most of my life in UK, I wasn't really familiar with the PEH. I'd never been in the PEH. I didn't know much about the health service. And one of the things which was really awful was that when Alan got quite ill in 2016, early 2016, he went back into the dementia assessment ward, which was now up at the Oberlands, and then they transferred him to Fougère ward. Now, I knew about the Catel Hospital and the connotations of being in the Catel Hospital. I had no idea that Fougère ward was a mental health ward. I should have known. Somebody should have told me, I suppose. I didn't know anything about it. I knew that the Catel Hospital had moved up to the Oberlands, and I knew there were wards called Hanois and some of the other lighthouse names. But I didn't know anything about Fougère ward, and that was a very bad time. For Alan, he was, when he went in to the dementia assessment ward initially, he was able to stand up. He wasn't able to walk very much, but he was able to stand up. And of course, once dementia patients, well, any patient possibly, go into these sorts of wards, they get hoisted. They don't use their legs. They're not encouraged to use their legs. There's no physio for them in these wards. And so from then onwards, Alan was hoisted, and he was in Fougère ward for 5 weeks. And I had a dreadful problem getting him out of Fougère ward, which is, I won't read that one out.
No.
But it was horrible. It was horrible. And that was, he lost his mobility completely after his time in those wards. I did manage to get him out, but he had to spend most of his time back home in bed and being hoisted out of bed and into a chair. I had to have a hoist. And that was really the end of his life. And that 5 weeks in that ward, contributed a lot to the end of his life. But he did die from an infection, which is what the lovely consultant told me to beware of all the time. So he did die from an infection and from pneumonia, which is, I gather, a kind way to die. So.
And at home, which was so important to both of you.
Yeah.
It's a really touching book. I'm welling up. I've read it twice, and I think that early sort of talking about your early experiences together really helps set the scene and get your characters in there. And even though, I mean, obviously you know what the book's about before you read it, so you know it's going to be a sad ending. But both times I've read it, I well up and start crying at the end. It's just still really sad. But good on you, Pat, for sticking to your guns like that. And twice you say, your main piece of advice really is, you know your husband, you know the person you're caring for.
Yeah.
You have to sometimes fight to be heard. It shouldn't be a fight, but you know best.
Yes, I mean, I fought to stop him going into hospital. He had lots of falls, and the St John's ambulance were absolutely brilliant. The paramedics, they were absolutely fantastic. They would come and they would pick him up, and they would say he perhaps should go into hospital, and I would say, no, please, just put him back into bed or put him in his chair and what have you. I don't want him to go into A&E. So for a long time, I kept him out of hospital. But then, as it progressed, the illness progressed, and he got worse. Then occasionally, I had to agree for him to go to A&E. But then I would plead with them and say, no, I don't want him to be admitted. And in most cases, I managed to take him back home. But again, there were times when he was so ill that I had to allow him to be admitted. It was he hated it. I mean, the first time he was admitted, I left him in this clinical ward and went home, and then they phoned me and they said, "Can you come back, because he's calling for you. He's just calling for you all the time." So I drove back again. By the time I got back there, he'd been sedated, and this is one of the things I mention in my book, is that I know it's difficult. It's difficult in these clinical wards if someone is screaming and shouting and that they can't disturb other patients. I do understand that. But the answer is to sedate them. And the sedation was for several hours, because I would often go and visit Alan during the morning. They would let me go in the morning, not just visiting time. And he would be sedated, and I would sit with him for 3 or 4 hours, and before he came out of the sedation, which I quite objected to, really, because it meant in many cases he'd missed his breakfast and he'd missed his lunch. And he came through around about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So yes, I had my problems with the hospital and their attitude, and trying to stop me taking Alan home from a clinical ward. And the consultant who I met all those years ago, when he was first diagnosed, was absolutely wonderful. Often, on one occasion, she was there in the clinical ward, And I said to her, look, please, can I take Alan home? Alan wants to come home. Can I take him home? And I've been told that he's got to stay because there are some more blood tests they want to do. And she said, oh, that's nonsense. He doesn't have to be in hospital to have blood tests. You know, you can get that done at his surgery. So, and she allowed me to take him home. She was wonderful. And on very many other occasions when he was in a clinical ward, she would support me when I said I wanted to discharge him early. So she was amazing, and she and the psychiatrist, they were the two people who understood that clinical wards are not the place for dementia patients. No. They are not the place for dementia patients. So yeah, I had my problems with the hospital. And I knew my strengths and weaknesses, and you know, I'm a very independent person. Alan was very independent, but I am extremely independent. My mother was very independent, and she lived all her life independently. You only have to say to me that I can't cope, which is what they were saying to me. Yeah. You can't cope. You need respite. You need to go in. No, I don't. I can cope. You only have to tell me I can't cope for me to see it as a challenge. So yes, I mean, I wanted to keep him at home, and it was important to me that he was at home. And it wasn't easy, but I coped. Yeah. And I do think home is the best place for dementia patients.
Mm. Can I ask, what do you think is the most challenging aspect of keeping a cared for at home? I mean, if there's one particular challenge which you would pass on to advise others in your situation?
I think you've the challenge. I suppose the challenge for me was I was quite busy, and I run a charity, as you know, and I had to accept that my charity definitely comes second, and that Alan always came first. And if Alan wanted to do something, I had to allow him to do it. So that was hard for me. The most challenging thing about the illness was the double incontinency, and that was really terrible for him. It wasn't easy for me, but the thought of what it meant for Alan was awful. The trying to work out what Alan wanted, the whole area when he was screaming and you didn't really know what he wanted, you didn't know what it was. And because I hadn't had children, I didn't have the experience of that. And somebody once told me, who'd had several children, that he'd worked out when his children screamed that it was one of five perhaps different things. It was either they were wet, they were hungry, they were bored, they were I can't remember all the five, but you know, if you've had children, I think you know what that is. I found the screaming side of it very difficult. I didn't know what he wanted, what the problem was. So it was a huge learning curve, really, just to cope with somebody with those problems.
Would it have helped if Alan had been diagnosed earlier with dementia? I mean, you said from 2008 you suspected something.
Yes.
But he wasn't diagnosed until 2013, I think.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, and again, we know this from the experience we've had or feedback from other carers. You know, the difficulty of communicating with the doctor, because as you say, the GP will say, well, there's patient confidentiality, I can't discuss things with you.
Yes. And
that is a real issue, I think, that a lot of carers have.
Yes.
But were they even aware of the possibility of dementia during that 5 years?
No, I wasn't. Towards the the end, just before I went to his doctor, I was aware that there was something very wrong with him. I thought he had Parkinson's. He had shaking hands and he couldn't hold a cup of tea. So I thought he had Parkinson's. It took me 2-3 years, 8, 9, 10. Yeah, I mean, I think if I had been able to go to his doctor much earlier, it would have helped. He would have been on the dementia drug a lot earlier, because dementia patients can last years. You can go on for years with dementia. If he'd been diagnosed much earlier, it would have helped considerably, and it would have helped me sort of work out what to do. The mistake I made was not anticipating his future needs, and that was because I didn't know what the future needs would be. As I said earlier,
and you didn't have guidance as to what to expect.
No, nobody told me what to expect. So that's something that people need to be able to have some guidance as to what to expect. I don't know whether people think that because there's so much on the internet that you'll automatically go and look something up on the internet. And I did look up some things, but it wasn't until much later on that I found some really useful information.
I mean, another thing that you mentioned, which I think also resonates, again, feedback we have from 1 or 2 people, is the challenges you had with the authority. And one of the issues we have is, we understand, and one of the things we need to look at, I think, is there needs to be a clear guidance for carers as to how they navigate through the various processes. I mean, you mentioned the example of being hijacked, or Alan being hijacked, which sounds appalling.
Yes.
But I mean, you need somebody to be able to tell you how to respond to that, how to challenge that.
Yes.
And that's one of the things I think that I think we've identified that there's a gap in. We need to look how we can fill that gap as Carers Guernsey.
Yes.
To help people through that process.
Yes.
Yes. You're fairly strong-willed, and you were able to challenge because the person you are. But a lot of people get intimidated.
Oh well, I'm sure they do. And I met a lady in Fougere Ward. She used to come and visit her husband at the same time as I did. And Fougere Ward, the patients all sat around. I don't know whether you've been in the ward, but it's a circular room, and all the patients sit around in these chairs, and so they spend their whole day just sitting around. And her husband, I noticed, was there. He was at the far end, and she used to come and visit him every day, and he used to be asleep, and she might give him a bit of a drink, but nothing else. And one day I said to her, "How long has your husband been here?" And she said, "Well, she said, 18 years, 18 years. I said, "What, 18 years? Well, she said, "Not 18 years here, but he was in the King Edward, and then he was in the Cattell Hospital, and now he's here." And I said, but why? I mean, what happened to bring him here? And she said, "Well, he was having difficulty standing, and so they told me he had to go into hospital, that I couldn't cope." So that was I'm not saying this in a derogatory term, but a typical old little Gurn. I mean, do you know what I mean? I don't mean to be derogatory, but not somebody as independent and as stroppy as me. And poor thing, and so she was visiting him every day, and
No, I think it's something we are aware of. I mean, somebody else has described it almost as being bullied into accepting that your loved one has to go into an institution.
That was the word you used.
Well, shall I read that last bit?
Yeah.
Shall I read that last
Page
bit? Then?
147. About.
Right. Yes, Alan, this is 11th of August 2016. Alan had been in Fougere ward for 5 weeks. Now, I had told Fougere ward a week or so before this item that I wanted to take Alan home. I had employed a full-time carer. She'd been a part-time carer for me. She was a very experienced mental health nurse, and she'd been working part-time for me during 2016. And she was going to come back, and I managed to get a license for her to work for me full-time. So they knew that I had a full-time carer coming, and this is 11th of August. They told me at a previous ward meeting that I couldn't take Alan home unless I bought a special chair that he'd been sitting in Fougere ward. It was called a tilt-in space chair he'd been sitting in. And so I said to them, I was furious. I said to them, but you know, this hasn't been mentioned before, so how long is it going to take to get this chair? And they said 6 to 8 weeks. I said, this is ridiculous. I went home and I actually phoned up the company that provided this chair, and I got the marketing manager on the phone, and I said, and I poured out my story that I was desperately trying to get my husband out of hospital, and they said he couldn't come out unless we bought one of your chairs, and could you do anything for me? And she said yes. She said, I'll get it to you within a week. So I got this chair. So this was the next ward meeting, 11th of August. His new chair arrived at 9. The ward meeting had started when I arrived at the hospital. Alan was very quiet and he wouldn't look at me, and I couldn't get him to speak. Then he went to sleep. Got called into the meeting at 2:40. I refused to purchase the additional items which were now on the equipment list. They'd sent me a letter before this ward meeting saying that I had to buy 3 or 4 additional pieces of equipment before Alan could go home. I refused to purchase the additional items which were now on the equipment list. I reminded them that I'd spent thousands of pounds on making our home as disabled friendly as possible. Alan's doctor had been marvellous. I'd written to him for help, and he'd emailed me back. I read out Alan's doctor's email where he had said that home was the best medicine for Alan. They finally agreed that I could take him home with a care plan that they would prepare, and the hoist is going to have to be used. They said we could use the sitting service again. I'd been blacklisted on the sitting service because Alan on one occasion had lashed out at one of the sitters because she had stopped him smoking when he was sitting at the front door. And it was my fault, really. The sitting service didn't like smokers. And I had said when I first used the sitting service that he smoked in 2 areas. One was in the kitchen upstairs and one was in the utility downstairs. But I'd forgotten, of course, that when Alan started sitting at the front door trying to escape, that I had relinquished that so that he could sit there and smoke. And he'd started to smoke, or wanted to smoke, and she told him he couldn't, and so he lashed out at her. And then he called her a silly cow. A silly fat cow. A silly fat cow. And so I got blacklisted after that. They stopped me using the sitting service. Anyway, so after this ward meeting, I wrote, it was a huge relief that I shouldn't have had to have gone through this ordeal. I wondered how many other families had been bullied in this way, and yes, I considered it was bullying and not in Alan's interest. We'd been married for 52 years, and therefore I knew him better than anyone. Together we'd shared 5 homes, and both of us loved our homes and felt happiest within them. Doctors had told me on 2 occasions they couldn't do anything more for Alan. At least I could keep him happy in the safety, security and familiarity of his own home and spoil him with treats. Alan would also benefit from 2-to-1 care because I had a full-time carer coming. This was yet another stressful occasion when I had to fight to take my husband home. If you find yourself in a similar situation and you feel you can cope, stick to your guns, is my advice.
No, absolutely.
Well, it's full of very good advice throughout the book. And as I say, a really touching story.
Yeah.
I certainly took away quite a few pointers that I thought, well, carers Guernsey really need to be looking in these areas.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any particular advice? Because obviously you didn't have the benefit of a charity that would support carers at the time. Do you think that is a gap that was needed? Is there anything particular you think we should do?
I think it is a gap. And I think your one-to-one thing is the most important thing, because I didn't want to go to that Alzheimer's meeting. I didn't really want to go to something like that. The one-to-one care and advice that you're giving, I think, is really important. I think that's important because I think if I'd known that there was something like this, that I could talk to somebody on a one-to-one basis, I should have been able to talk to some of the health professionals, I would have thought, but maybe it's me. Maybe it was me. I blame myself that I was too independent. And
but you mentioned a few times you were quite nervous about talking to professionals sometimes, like the social worker or
yes,
yes,
yeah,
you're a bit afraid, especially
yes. Yes, so I think what you're doing is wonderful, and I think it's very much needed, something like this.
I wish we'd been around when you needed us.
Yes, I wish you had, but there we are.
Thank you very much, Pat.
Thank you very much, Pat.
Thank you.